So tonight we're going to do something which I don't think I've even done anything similar to this. We're going to be discussing, well, what are called the platforms of Reform Judaism. And these are, as we'll see, they are platforms adopted by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And there's a couple of things I should say by way of broad introduction. We have talked about the different movements in Judaism. Reform Judaism gets its start I believe in the 1820s in Germany. And it gets its start as the answer to the question, how are we to remain Jewish in a world that accepts us? So for, 3,000 years or more, we have understood how to be Jewish in a world from which we stay apart. And, a big misconception about Judaism, particularly by non-Jews, is that Judaism is also a people or a nation, and it's a nation apart from other nations. And for the millennia and the centuries, Jews have always understood ourselves as being apart from other nations and really citizens of Israel, even though, the last time a ruler in the Holy Land ruled Israel was, sometime around the year zero, 2,000 years ago. And but we've always understood ourselves to be a separate nation, and we more or less live apart from the other nations. In the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, a new phenomenon arises, and that phenomenon is, at least on paper, a world that accepts that Jews are really just citizens of their home country of a different religion. So Jews living in Germany can be German citizens. Jews living in France can be French citizens and pay taxes, and be loyal to their home country. This is a new idea in Judaism, and so Reform Judaism really gets its beginning by struggling with the question: how are we going to deal with this world with which we are a part, and we want to participate and still remain Jewish? Bryce, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. This is really fascinating to me because I understand that you framed it the way you did colloquially. Okay, how do we be Jews in a world that accepts us? But I want to know, how did they frame it then? They were getting together to look at this, but how did they frame it at the time?
Well, so I'm really not terribly knowledgeable about what happened in Germany in the 1820s, but what we're going to see very clearly is how American Judaism began to frame this. Alan.
So, Bryce, I'll give you a really basic example that
Okay.
was on the minds of the German Jews at this time to reflect the Enlightenment that we're talking about. They said to their leaders, a group of the Jewish leaders, we'd like the prayer book to be partly in Hebrew and partly in German because so many people don't really know Hebrew. And they said, no way. And that was one of many steps that caused a group of Jewish leaders to say, to be in the modern century, our people need to understand. And the prayer book was the kind of the corner speed that we'll see more in the platforms in America. But this kind of thing is illustrated. I wanted to say. I hope I'm answering your question, Bryce.
Well, yeah. I was wondering, because I understand that some rabbis at the time might have seen it as a threat to holiness, or a threat to a threat to various things, okay, or a threat to, their ability to interpret, okay, what it should mean and what people. So there may be many possibilities. So what I was wondering is, you may not know, but how did they frame it to themselves, not to say that they were like going off the reservation, so to speak? I'm really interested in how they do that.
Yeah, and it certainly would be worth my taking a closer look at it. My guess is that you had you had Jews that weren't so observant, but they wanted to remain Jewish. But if they
Mm-hmm.
were going to remain Jewish in any classical sense, they would have trouble being good German citizens, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll offer two other items, that Alan mentioned. One which I find really fascinating was, I think it's Mendelssohn, but I won't swear to it, has the first translation of the Hebrew Bible into German. And the fascinating thing, which I only realized a few years ago, or maybe even less than that, is that it was written with Hebrew characters. So Jews who were living in Germany at that time could speak German, but they with they basically couldn't read German. They were all literate reading Hebrew. So they basically printed what we would call a transliteration of the Hebrew Bible in German with Hebrew characters. Alan.
Yeah, I can't not tell you this story. There was a phase when I was studied to become bar mitzvahed, that the teaching system actually used Hebrew letters to teach. We used English words, but we used Hebrew
Yes.
letters. Okay, it's the same kind of thing. We didn't have long extended sessions. We were trying to learn the alphabet, and rather than learning Hebrew words that have meaning, we had words that didn't
Yeah,
have
it's
any.
kind of a fun exercise to write, the story of Goldilocks in
Well,
English with Hebrew characters to help
the
you.
word street, I always use samach, taf, resh, and so forth. That's how you get to street. And
Yes.
but
So
I later felt I was deprived of really learning Hebrew. But
yeah.
okay.
So of course this is quite different, because basically people wanted a Bible in German, but they weren't literate, particularly because German, I think of more than 100 years ago, used very different characters than even Roman characters.
Yeah,
So
black letter is what they called it, where you try to look at and it's like you can't even read it. It's so dense and
yeah,
weird
it's
and
it's it's
yes.
very different, and so they wrote it in German characters. I'll call on you in a moment, Erwin. The other thing which is quite notable, and it's worth taking a closer look at, was I think it's in 1806 that Napoleon convened a Sanhedrin, which is to say he got 70 rabbis together, because the
Okay.
Sanhedrin hadn't met in probably 1,500 years, and posed a series of, I think it was 20 some questions to them. And the questions were basically along the lines of, are you guys Frenchmen, um, practicing a different religion, or are you really citizens of Israel? And ask very specific questions about who you're loyal to and so on. And by and large, my understanding is that the rabbis told him what he wanted to hear, except they would refuse to acknowledge intermarriage, marriage of Jews to non-Jews. And that was one of the questions. Erwin.
Rabbi, I don't remember ever to hear in Hungary or in Budapest, but basically in Hungary, a Reform synagogue. And most of, I should say, all Jews lived in a ghetto, and they were not accepted to rent an apartment or buy a house outside of a ghetto. So, and also, I remember my mother had a siddur. It was Yiddish and Hebrew,
Right.
not
Um,
Hungarian, not Hungarian and Hebrew,
right.
Yiddish and Hebrew.
Right. And of course, you're talking about, less than 100 years ago. I don't know that there was any reform movement in Hungary. I just plain don't know.
Well,
I
the
know
same
that.
thing is the same thing was in Italy. Italy, the Italian Jews lived in a ghetto.
Yeah, but that was during the 20s and 30s. I don't think it dates much earlier than that, but I'm not sure. Um, but anyway, that's sort of off the topic. Alan?
Well, I was going to respond to everyone a little bit. I looked up 1860s, but what I would put the context. I've met some South Africans that are my age or about my age who live here, and their recollection when they lived in South Africa, there were no Reform Judaism because it was a small amount of it in a lot of places, and based on the fact that you, Erwin, and my friend Paul had no connection, no awareness that anything was but orthodoxy, even in the middle of the 20th century, or let's say when we were alive or younger. And so for that reason, that's why you and I'm saying we don't, people don't generally are aware of Reform Judaism unless they look at it or happen to have been part of it, but it's a very tiny influence in the early years.
Yeah, and I would say I would say it's only recently becoming more widespread. So, I think the first Israeli Reform rabbis were ordained, 20, 30 years ago. There were American rabbis who went to Israel I'm talking about Reform rabbis, who would lead Reform congregations. But until very recently, the Reform movement really was not very strong anywhere in the world except for North America, England, and Germany. There's a seminary for Reform Judaism in England, and there's a seminary for Reform Judaism in Germany.
And now there's one in Buenos Aires.
Yeah, okay, I'm not familiar with that one. Of course, there's one in Israel. So the other interesting thing, which is worth being aware of, when Reform Judaism comes to the United States, the leader is a fellow by the name of Isaac Mayer Wise, and he has an interesting biography, which I'm not going to dwell on, but he envisioned that this movement would be American Judaism, that there would not be different movements of Judaism in the United States or America, North America, and Canada and United States. But he envisioned Reform Judaism was going to be American Judaism. And if you look at the names of the institutions that he founded, that comes clear. The Rabbinic Association is the Central Conference of American Rabbis. The congregational organization was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and the seminary was a Hebrew Union College. So there was no mention of reform in any of them. I can't remember how long ago the Union for UAHC changed its name to URJ, the Union for Reform.
The mid-1990s.
Yeah, so not very long ago. And people point to a severing event, which was when the first group of ordinees from Hebrew Union College were ordained. They were ordained in Cincinnati, which was, at that time, the Wild West, and separate from New York, New England. And they had this great banquet at a hotel in Cincinnati, apparently the finest hotel in Cincinnati, and they put on a dinner, and lo and behold, on the dinner, and there are copies of the menu you can find, with shrimp cocktail and other prohibited foods.
The Trafe banquet.
I'm sorry?
They called it the Trafe banquet.
Right, the Trafe banquet. And so you can imagine all the non-reform rabbis, and there were non-reform rabbis, obviously, in the United States and in Cincinnati, walked out in a huff. And I think Wise's vision of Reform Judaism being the American form of Judaism, died at that point.
Was that sabotage deliberately?
We don't know. There is. I have never read a definitive conclusion on that, or whether just the caterer screwed it up, or whether it was a deliberate way of pushing the theology that kashrut is no longer going to be an issue for us. But maybe more recent scholarship has.
No, you say it the right way. I mean, it still continues to be not clear, and those are the two options. Yeah.
But the fact that there was a menu, and you could look at the menu, presumably the menu was available to the authorities sometime before. There was a very minor example of this in Camarillo, believe it or not. And it was actually before I became rabbi. Apparently, they had a Passover Seder at one of the local venues, and big restaurant, or I can't remember what it was. And in the salad there were croutons, And so, the congregation was very careful, saying no bread, no rolls, and so on, and have matzah and so on. But they didn't think to tell them don't have croutons. And of course that got very upset, but the synagogue managed to survive. Okay.
You heard
So-
the joke that the reason the city is called Cincinnati is because of the sin of the Trafe banquet.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, thank you.
It's not,
Cheryl.
that's not true,
Oh, the
actually.
Trafa banquet and the end of a dream. Oh, in my Jewish learning. Oh, cool. Yeah, I gotta take
It's
a look at
obviously not why it's named
If you,
Cincinnati.
if you hit
Impact.
that, it has the
Barbara.
banquet menu in it.
that. Okay. Thank you. So
And then you
I'm gonna,
could share
gonna
it, but
go-
it's again, it's all unusual stuff.
okay, I am gonna go to share screen, and this is the link I sent out, and we'll send out again. So this is the Central Conference of American Rabbis has a website, ccarnet.org. And so here is the page which talks about the platforms. So I just want you to be aware of it. And oh, by the way, there's also some interesting things. If you're interested in Responsa, there's a searchable index of Reform Responsa, different resolutions, statements, news, I guess, CCAR press. This is an interesting book. Anyway, so as you glance at this page, I presume you can see the page. You would have told me if you couldn't. So there is the first platform, which we're going to take a look at tonight, is the Pittsburgh platform in 1885. So it's, within 10 or 15 years of the founding of the CCAR. And then the next one is, quite a bit later, the Columbus platform in 1937. Then there's one, San Francisco, 1976. Then Miami platform, 1997. And so-called Pittsburgh platform in 1999. And then there's also actually an article that's quite long. I'll take a closer look at it. So I didn't think it was the kind of thing we would read together. But one of the things, of course, we're going to see as we look at this material is how Reform Judaism has changed over the years. And you'll see as we look at the first one, it's pretty dramatic. And the other thing is, I'm not aware of any other movement in Judaism coming up with anything resembling these kinds of platforms. I might be wrong about it, but I think certainly it is not true in Orthodoxy. I don't think the conservative movement has sort of a statement of principles. I probably ought to look for that, but I've never heard of one, and my guess is I would have heard of it if it exists.
Well, it stands to reason, because if you're orthodoxy and you are saying we're the right way, you don't need to make a statement of what your principles are.
Yeah, but the
Presumably-
different
Right.
Orthodox movements are very different from one another. So it might be helpful to have a fairly concise statement of, what Chabad treats differently than Satmar Hasidism, and how modern Orthodox is different than Hasidic. I just think it would be useful, but I'm not aware of anything resembling that. But
Yeah,
I
they
certainly don't
probably don't want to put out a menu.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
The conservative movement has, and Reconstructionists, they have counterparts for these platforms.
Okay, I would be interested in knowing those.
Only because that's how we know such things as that the conservative movement allows mixed seating of men and women in the synagogue. How do people come to know that? You know what I mean?
So what I would say is the conservative movement has a law committee, and they will have responsa addressing issues like that. And they may even have reports of the law committee on certain subjects, like mixed seating. But that will be a specific statement on a specific issue, rather than, as we'll see tonight, a broad statement, of only about a page or so, covering lots of issues. But
Okay.
yeah, but that is true. Okay, I presume you can see the page,
Mhm.
Pittsburgh. Okay, so this is so-called Pittsburgh platform in 1885, and let's see, I can actually make this a little bigger. Oh, let's see how this works. Okay, that should be a little easier to read. Okay, so would someone like to read 1885 Pittsburgh Conference?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you, Bryce.
1885 Pittsburgh Conference, convening at the call of Kaufman Kohler of New York, Reform rabbis from around the United States met from November 16th through November 19th, 1885, with Isaac Mayer Wise presiding. The meeting was declared the continuation of the Philadelphia Conference of 1869, which was the continuation of the German Conference of 1841 to 1846.
Yeah, so that's
The rabbis
actually a place where
adopted the following. I'm sorry?
I know I was going to say that's something to do some searching on those conferences.
The rabbis adopted the following seminal text. 1. We recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite, and in every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling of God in man. We hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our holy scriptures and developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. We maintain that Judaism preserved and defended midst continual struggles and trials and under enforced isolation this God idea as the central religious truth for the human race.
Okay, so as I read that, I would say the central issues is absolute understanding and recognition of the idea of God, a recognition of other religious systems, but the concept of Judaism being the highest conception of God in our scriptures, and beginning to, and we'll see in other items here, to understand sort of the historical development of Judaism. I'll call on Jay and then Bryce.
Can I speak? Can you hear me?
I hear you fine, yes.
I'd like to know your feelings about the central religious truth for the human race.
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I would go along with that. I would say Judaism
What do you mean you would go along with that, Rabbi?
I'm sorry?
What do you mean you would go along with that?
There is nothing about that statement with which I disagree. Although I must admit I'm maybe a little more pluralistic. I mean, my sort of standard phrase is any religion that teaches human life is sacred and the golden rule applies. Don't do to other people what you would not want them have to do to you is kosher.
Okay,
but yeah, I would say for me, Judaism is the highest conception of the God idea.
But if you read the beginning of the line, we maintain that Judaism preserved and defended. It's like saying that Judaism preserved as the central religious truth for the human race. That sort of, it says to me that we're right, Catholicism is wrong.
No, I don't think it's saying that, because Catholicism would not disagree with the God idea as a central religious truth for the human race. And I would say, Jews would say, I would agree with the Jewish teaching that the Jewish concept of God is a more accurate concept of God than a Christian concept of God.
Oh, really? You feel that way?
Yeah, I wouldn't say the Christian concept of God is wrong or flawed, but I think I would say that the Jewish concept of God is truer.
I wonder how many.
And remember, this is 1885 or whatever the number is. We're going to see this change. So this is not a statement of principle of the current teachings of Reform Judaism.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something I believe I have to say over and over again.
I think that's a good idea, to do, because that line raises the hackles, okay, of people that are more ecumenical, so to
Yes.
speak, across the world. I mean, one of the interesting things, if you look at world histories from a while ago, it was Europe, okay? That was the world, was Europe.
Right.
Okay.
Eurocentric. Mhm.
Okay. And this is like, hey, everyone we see believes like it's like, what
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
Buddhism?
So I appreciate your admonition, and we'll accept it that we need to keep reminding ourselves is this is the vision in I can't now remember the date, in 1885, and it will change, and so the rabbis over the years will disagree. Alan.
I just wanted to say that what isn't a jump right out, but we know they know it and want us to know it, is monotheism. And Rabbi, you added the word that makes you comfortable and me comfortable, is the word pluralism. So it's allowing for different ways at looking the God idea, but there's really only one God. If I'm applying this paragraph.
Yeah, and the other sort of important word that is not explained is developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers. They're talking about the rabbis, not so they're distinguishing Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, from biblical Judaism. They're not talking about going back to animal sacrifice. Erwin.
Yeah, I am surprised that none of these article, or maybe it's going to be later on, mention Stephen S. Wise and Leo Beck.
Yeah, because this is written before Stephen S. Wise and Leo Beck are born.
Stephen S. Wise was started in 1920.
Okay, so this is written in
he was
1885. So Stephen S. Wise was either a baby or not born yet. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And again, we have to keep track of the fact that this is 1885. Jay, did you have something else you wanted to add, or?
No.
Okay. So if you don't have anything else to add, please put your virtual hands down. It'll be easier for me. Okay, Bryce, do you want to continue with item number 2?
We recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God, and value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific researches in the domains of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age, and at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice dealing with men in miraculous narratives.
So I would say, for me, this is a hint of don't take this literally.
Yeah.
That there's a sense that they're beginning to embrace what I would call a scholarly investigation of the Bible rather than a literal investigation of the Bible, and it's stated pretty tentatively.
That's very powerful to me.
So they don't believe that God wrote the Torah.
I would say in terms of most Reform rabbis that I know would not accept that God wrote the Torah word for word literally. Because if you accept that, then you should keep kosher. You should, strictly observe the Sabbath. And if you're a Reformed Jew, you're probably not doing that. So I would say a big issue distinguishing Reformed Judaism from more traditional Judaism is what are we to make of the the literal nature of the Torah. And we're starting to see that here in 1885.
Do they accept Messiah?
Do I accept the Messiah? I'm not sure what you mean by that. In fact,
well, the Messiah will be coming. It's in.
Okay, so the Messiah, is the English translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, and there are dozens of people in the Bible who were anointed and were kings of Israel, and who are Mashiach. I sort of doubt that we will have another king of Israel that will be anointed. I don't believe in a supernatural concept of one person being a Messiah. I will see, and we'll see this in the subsequent discussions of the platforms. Reform Judaism generally talks about a messianic age rather than an individual Messiah. Stephen.
In terms of your point about if you would believe the Torah to be the literal word of God, you'd be obligated to keep kosher. You'd be obligated to keep those things that are explicitly stated in the Torah, but not all of what we now consider to be keeping kosher. Like the Torah says, don't cook the kid in its mother's
Yes,
milk.
yes.
You
Okay,
believe
but
that God said that.
yeah. We're not going to
that
argue about this, Stephen.
You have
So,
to keep 6 hours of separation.
Stephen, take a breath. Traditional Judaism says Moses got an oral Torah, and all that other stuff is in the oral Torah. So traditional Judaism would say both are the words of God.
Yep.
But you're right.
You could believe, and I believe the Karaites or something. There's some group that actually does this. That you can believe that the written Torah is the word of God, but not believe in the oral Torah.
Yes, that's possible. That is possible. Okay, Bryce, let's move on to number 3.
We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization.
Okay,
Very
and we're going
powerful
to see.
statement.
I'm sorry?
Very powerful statement.
Yes, and we're going to see it explained even more in item number 4. In fact, let's read item number 4 and then we'll discuss it.
We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observation in our days is apt rather to obstruct rather than to further modern spiritual elevation.
Okay, so that's even stronger.
Yes.
And so you have a clear statement here, I would say, of this beginning of the statement that the part of Jewish law that Reform Judaism is going to take as binding are moral laws, ethical laws, and not ritual laws. And of course, what we'll see over the years is the Reform movement will continue this to the point where it would not be considered appropriate for a Jew in a synagogue to wear a yarmulke or to wear a talit, and might be asked to remove them in a traditional, what's called classical reform. And of course, that's going to change in the subsequent statements of principles. Alan.
So this was created in English, and so there isn't a need for figuring out how it was translated. So I'm focusing on something that sounds like chutzpah, which is views and habits of modern civilization. I was led to believe, and you even said, Rabbi, that Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise tried to create an American Judaism. And so this statement is way too broad for what I like to think of as, a Reform Judaism at the time that this was written, I would say.
So my sense of this is he's talking about wearing payas, wearing tzitzit all the time, keeping your head covered all the time, absolutely refraining from work on the Sabbath.
But he's including his former German friends and other places when he says civilization. That's the world. He could use the word the world, doesn't he? Okay, I
don't see a huge difference in that, but basically what he's saying is it's modern times. We are going to reject those aspects of Judaism which seem to belong in ancient times and fail to impress us as being significant. Erwin and then Bryce.
It is confusing to me, Rabbi, that let's say the New York Central Synagogue, Temple Adat Elohim, and other Reformed temples, they light the Shabbat candles, and most of the liturgy is in Hebrew, and they read the Torah.
Yeah,
So
I'm gonna say this again and again.
uh,
Erwin, 1885. It's
what's
changed.
going on?
It's changed. We're no longer. This is meant to be a historical investigation of the development of the Reform Judaism. If you went to a Reform synagogue in the 1920s, it would be very different than what you see now. In
Yeah,
fact,
these things what you are telling me are the building blocks of Reform Judaism,
I will
aren't they?
say it is the building blocks, some of which have been torn down, and it's the history.
Erwin, the building block document of the United States of America says that we can have slaves.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. Yeah, so the Constitution, originally allowed slavery. The Constitution treated black people, when you're counting them, as I think 2/3 of a person, or I can't remember.
3/5.
3/5.
3/5.
So it's been changed, and so yes. So I don't want to overly focus on the fact that we no longer do this.
I don't want to compare the Constitution to the Torah because the Constitution was written by humans and the Torah was written by God. So it's two different.
Erwin, neither you nor I would be comfortable with Reform Judaism in 1885. Well, we're going to see 4 other statements of principles. So,
and the statement that was written in 1885 was written by humans, not by God.
Well, this
Yes.
is
Well, Erwin, you will see that reality gets changed to make you more comfortable.
yes.
So,
Bryce, do you have something you wanted to add?
I did. I wanted to say something. I wanted to say, because you had mentioned before the kerfluffle that the folks are becoming, they're becoming so much more, I would say, radical in the sense of rejecting orthodoxy and becoming very, very, trying to become more mainstream. But you'll look at many ideas and they will arc up and then they will overshoot and then arc back down. And they'll kind of do a diminishing sinusoidal thing over time. They will overshoot one way and then become a correction and back, and and things settle in eventually around some mean, but they shoot around for a while.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. Let's continue with number 5. I hope we can at least get.
We recognize in the modern era of universal culture, of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state.
Okay, so this is a very powerful statement of where in 1885 Reform Judaism is separating itself from traditional Jewish belief of the past 2,000 years, which is to say that we are no longer a nation, but a religious community. One of the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah is that all the Jews will return to the Holy Land. They reject that. We don't look forward to sacrificial worship under, at the temple in Jerusalem. On Monday nights, I'm teaching about we're having a discussion about the Amidah. So if you look at today's, modern Orthodox prayer book, just happen to have it here. If you look at this Orthodox prayer book and you look at the Amidah, one of the prayers of the Amidah, the weekday Amidah, is praying for the restoration of temple sacrifice. So traditional Judaism still clings to the idea that with the coming of the Messiah, there will be a new kingdom in Israel, a political state, a Jewish state in Israel, and that there will be a 3rd temple built and we will resume animal sacrifice. So a huge difference here is that Reform Judaism is rejecting that idea. I would say Reform Judaism has continued to reject the idea that we look forward to the restoration of animal sacrifice, but Reform Judaism does change in understanding Judaism as a people rather than just a religious community. Erwin, I don't know if you have another question or your just hand is still up.
No, I just, no
Okay,
other question.
okay, I'll put it down. Let's go
Thank
into
you.
number 6.
We recognize in Judaism a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. We are convinced of the utmost necessity of preserving the historical identity with our great past. Christianity and Islam being daughter religions of Judaism, we appreciate their providential mission to aid in the spreading of monotheistic and moral truth. We acknowledge that the spirit of broad humanity of our age is our ally in the fulfillment of our mission, and therefore we extend the hand of fellowship to all who cooperate with us in the establishment of the reign of truth and righteousness among men.
So here I see something which I think is different than traditional Judaism, which is the idea that we recognize that Christianity and Islam have a providential mission, spread monotheism and moral truth, and language of extending the hand of fellowship, which presumably means cooperation and discussion. Whereas certainly in the Ashkenazi world, there was not a lot of sort of official interaction between the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. Alan.
These first two sentences are, I know they have real deep meaning, but they're hard to follow. You talk about a progressive religion, and you talk about the necessity of preserving the historical identity, which I'm trying to get it, but I'm telling you, it's very complicated the way I read it.
Yeah, so the way I read that is we're preserving our identity. Our identity as Jews go back thousands of years, but the way we practice our religion is progressive, and we're going to change the way we practice the religion as time goes on things like keeping kosher and observing a lot of ritual practice. That's
I
the way
pick up something as well, Rabbi, from the first sentence. Ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason.
Yeah, I'm glad you're highlighting that. Yes.
Yes, because to me, that is a statement that simply because someone asserts something with authority that contravenes obvious reality, we don't have to accept that because our betters have told us so.
Well, where did the 10 Commandments come from?
I'm sorry, I say again.
Where did the 10 Commandments come from?
The 10 Commandments are in the Bible.
From the Bible, from God gave Moses the 10 Commandments to walk down that mountain with it and present it to the Jewish people. It didn't come from somebody's mind it came from God. That's what I believe.
Yes, I understand. I would say this in 1885 is starting to question some of those things. So for example, in the Bible it says, if you have a stubborn and rebellious son, you should stone him to death. Do you think God wants us to do that?
No.
It's in the same Bible as the 10 Commandments. Actually, it's in the book of Deuteronomy. It's in the Torah. So what I would say is, now certainly the rabbis have a way of dealing with that. But what Reform Judaism is going to say, ultimately, is that where the biblical text is in conflict with our postulates of reason, we are going to stick with reason rather than a blind adherence to the words of the text.
So,
where did the text come from? From whose mind?
Hold on. So Orthodoxy would say the text was literally dictated by God to Moses. Okay. I would say Reform Judaism would say the text is our ever-evolving record of our interactions with God, but isn't necessarily the literal word of God.
Okay.
Okay. And let's see, we're almost there. So
I see it, Rabbi, as an attempt to preserve Judaism in the face of the fact that the world is changing, technology is changing, ideas are changing, people are questioning how they've understood nature and the relationships with nature. And when that comes into conflict with what they've read and taught, they really are afraid that people are just going to peel off because it stops making sense.
So what you have is, again, very broadly speaking, is the question is, how do we remain Jewish in a world that accepts us and in a world where we Jews want to do business with non-Jews?
Yes.
We want to be friends with non-Jews. We want to interact with non-Jews. The Reform answer is to reform Judaism and remove the barriers, whether they're intellectual in terms of how do we understand the Torah, or whether they're practical, which is to say, we're not going to keep strictly kosher anymore, because then if you keep strictly kosher, you can't really eat with non-Jews,
Yes.
and you've got a problem. That's Reform Judaism's answer. By the way, Hasidic Judaism's answer is we're going to pretend the modern world doesn't exist as much as possible. We're going to stay in our enclaves, and even in the heat of Jerusalem, we're going to continue to dress as though we're Polish noblemen with fur coats and fur hats when it's 100 degrees in Jerusalem. And we are going to avoid technology to the extent we possibly can. So yes, we need to use cell phones, but we're going to have cell phones that are not easily connected to the internet. And so that's another solution. And of course, conservative Judaism will emerge, with a different approach.
Rabbi, I think they're using steam telephones as opposed to electricity. Steam. I'm joking. It was a joke.
No, I mean, it's not a big deal not to use your telephone on Shabbat. Alan.
Bryce, I wanted to, oh shoot, I don't want to lose this thought. You remind me what you said a couple of minutes ago about.
Well, if you go up it's the first line. If you go up, I mean, to where I said that modern Jews would be looking at the modern technological world, and when it comes into conflict with a fundamental basic reading of the Torah, they would be afraid that more and more people would choose the reality of the technological world as opposed to putting on blinders and doing that.
Okay, so what I remember that I wanted to say that you prompted me is I read an article not too long ago how it's sort of the theme is how Reform Judaism rescued Judaism. And the context is that we also, or I say everybody, but I was oriented to thinking that the early reformers in the early 19th century were radicals. They wanted to change Judaism from the orthodoxy, and they weren't thinking about what this article says, which is if we didn't do that, if the reformers didn't do that, then the huge amount of people who are willing to walk away from Judaism wouldn't have a choice. So
the article doesn't say that. Bryce said it. We can argue whether it's true or not, but Reform Judaism wasn't a major movement for several hundred.
That's a good point. But the rescue part, which saving of Judaism, I didn't used to think of that, but that was a recent article I read. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to number 7.
7.
Is my hand raised?
No. But go ahead.
Jay.
Go ahead.
Can I talk?
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. The one thing that bothers me about this, and it really bothers me about my religion. Erwin said something a little earlier, and I have discussed this with Erwin several times in the years that I've known him. He believes that God wrote the Torah. I don't believe that 50% of the Reform Jewry believes that God wrote the Torah. I would like to know what you think.
Yeah, there's no conflict between those two statements. Erwin's not in the 50%. What's the problem?
No, I know that.
Yeah,
But
so we
so
don't,
much of this
we-
is written
we
as,
are not going to decide that question tonight.
oh, we're
and
not?
No, we're not. We're going to
Okay.
say that in 1885, a new movement is starting to crystallize teachings. And one of the teachings is to start moving away from this idea that the Torah is the literal word of God. That's what we're going to discuss. Or that's what I say this article says. It doesn't address the question of whether God wrote the Torah or not. Bryce.
Yeah, just very briefly, I remember going to Temple Israel probably in the mid to late 2000s, and being in there for High Holy Days with my in-laws. And the rabbi asked during the sermon, how many people believe in God? And I'd say I looked around and only about 10% of people raised their hands.
Uh-huh.
And even the rabbi was surprised.
So let me just comment on that. Is Larry Kushner talks about raising that same question in discussing with Jews. How many of you believe in God? And a small, a less than majority would say yes. And then later on in the discussion, he would ask, how many of you feel like you've had an intense personal experience with God? And then it was more like 70 or 80%.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't necessarily rational.
Well,
I want to finish.
Well, 1 second. Let me just take what you said. On the one hand, belief is rational, but an experience is like an emotional thing. It isn't a matter of belief. It's a matter of a feeling of experience. But you can analyze it and say that doesn't make sense to me. But at the same time, you can have that feeling.
I would say my own definition is that belief is different from knowledge, and belief isn't necessarily, it's subject to rational investigation, but it's not dependent on rational investigation. And Christianity is the best example of that. Christianity relies on belief, which definitionally is not rational, particularly because Paul has a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus, and there's nothing rational about that. So I don't quite go along with that. I want to read 7 and 8, and then we can discuss.
Okay. We reassert the doctrine of Judaism that the soul is immortal, grounding the belief on the divine nature of the human spirit, which forever finds bliss in righteousness and misery in wickedness. We reject as ideas not rooted in Judaism the beliefs both in bodily resurrection and in Gehenna and Eden, hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward.
Okay, so two really interesting ideas. That the soul is immortal, with some language around that. So a belief in the soul as being living forever, and a rejection of the idea of any kind of punishment as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. Okay, let's read the last one, and then we can
bodily
discuss.
Resurrection completely, and whatever abode that you want.
Yeah, it's definitely Reform Judaism will reject bodily resurrection, and to this day, in the Givorot, we don't say Mechayeh Hametim, we say Mechayeh Hakol, which is still a reflection of that. Although the text gives us a choice now, so it's opening up a bit. Okay, one more, and then we can discuss.
In full accordance with the spirit of the Mosaic legislation, which strives to regulate the relations between rich and poor, we deem it our duty to participate in the great task of modern times, to solve on the basis of justice and righteousness the problems presented by the contrasts and evils of the present organization of society.
So this reflects something, I think that's the last item here, yeah. This reflects something.
Kind of Tikkun Olam in a way.
Yeah. We can discuss Tikkun Olam. This reflects a major force in Reform Judaism, which emphasizes the prophetic in Reform Judaism, and the fact that the prophets would speak truth to power and stand up for righteousness and so on. So Reform Judaism definitely is emphasizing the ideas of righteousness, and Tikkun Olam is actually a statement which has a very different meaning in Kabbalah where it arises than we give it today. But basically, making the world a better place, that is going to be, I would say, the central motivating force behind Reform Judaism's self-understanding as it existed in the late 1800s. So
Sounds like a mission statement, doesn't it?
it is, yeah, I would say it is a mission statement. Jay and then Alan.
No, I've lowered my hand.
Okay, Jay. Alan, sorry.
So in the number 7, I'm reacting to this idea of the world to come, which has a different nuance, if I can use that word, from the Messiah. In other words, we're kicking around this idea of a Messiah in one place, or am I wrong in saying the world to come doesn't necessarily mean there's this concept of a Messiah, but there is a world to come which is supported by the immortal soul?
Okay, so none of this is discussed in this platform, but what you're talking about, we do see in discussions of Judaism. There's a phrase called Olam Haba, the world to come, and Olam Hazeh, this world. Olam Haba has more than one meaning. Sometimes it simply means the world that my soul goes to when I die, which I would say is, if we call the soul immortal, then we start asking questions about what happens to the soul after you die. I guess you can ask about a physical location, you can ask about a spiritual location, but whatever that world is, I think you could describe as Olam Haba. But also in Rabbinic Judaism, the same word is used for what will happen in this world when the Messiah comes and we have, the restoration of the monarchy and the third temple and animal sacrifice and resurrection of the dead. That is also called Olam Haba. So it is confusing because the same phrase is used in two different ways. Clearly, the 1885 platform is rejecting any idea of resurrection or an individual Messiah, or even, a place of punishment and reward. And actually, I would say, I remember what Bryce often talks about, that if you're not going to have any kind of reincarnation or resurrection, what's the point of punishing souls and rewarding souls if they're not going to come back? But so clearly that element of Judaism is going to be rejected, and the element of Judaism that the Reform movement will elevate is justice and how we treat people. Bryce.
Well, it's interesting that it says bodily resurrection. You see, it doesn't say you can't have a spiritual resurrection.
I don't know what you mean by spiritual resurrection.
In other words, since the soul is immortal, okay, then the soul then goes to live somewhere. It doesn't have to be in a body. The body has dropped away. Now it is the spirit and the soul, and you want to make a body for
okay.
you know what I'm saying?
Certainly, when Judaism speaks of resurrection, when Christianity speaks of resurrection, we're talking about bodily resurrection.
I understand, but it's less believable. But okay.
Okay, but that's what the word means, I believe.
I understand.
Alan.
So when you said that the emphasis is on treating other people, that didn't sound new to me, because don't we go by the Hillel statement about the golden rule, or the Hillel version of that? In other words, Judaism has always had a centerpiece of this point, but there's something about Reform Judaism you're trying to, or this platform is trying to stress, right?
Yeah, so what I would say is, you take an Orthodox Jew, and now the question is this person more notable for the way he approaches kashrut and wearing of tzitzit and tefillin, or how he treats his workers? Does he treat them equitably and fairly? I would say Orthodox Judaism would say both are commandments of God, and we aren't here to question which ones are more important. And Reform Judaism would say, no, that how you tie your tzitzit is not as important as how you treat your workers.
But Hillel didn't include that as, I'm just sort of
Yeah, but
going.
Hillel wasn't. Hillel said, "What's hateful to you, do not do to any other person. The rest is commentary. Go and study." So Hillel said, "You're supposed to study all this," and he was responding to a question: "How do? Please teach me the entire Torah on one foot."
Without needing to know a bunch of rituals and
Well,
those things.
you can't recite all those rituals while you're standing on one foot.
That's why Hillel and us like Reform Judaism.
No, so what I would say is Hillel is answering that question, but Hillel is never saying you don't have to worry about keeping kosher and doing all these other things. He is saying the abiding principle of the Torah is treating other people the way you want to be treated. And I don't know any Reform or Orthodox Jew that would disagree with that. The issue is, does that mean also I pray 3 times a day? I wear tefillin in the morning. I wear tzitzit all the time. I keep strictly kosher, and all those other things. Or, so I would say that's the difference. When I mean, I think it's very sad to say, if I'm dealing with an Orthodox Jew, I am very confident that he's keeping kosher. I'm not so confident that he's an honest businessman. I say that with shame. If I'm dealing with a Mormon, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I am more likely to believe that that person is an honest, ethical person than I am necessarily an Orthodox Jew. I say that with a sense of shame. And, I wish I could say it about Reform Judaism, but at least Reform Judaism is saying what is important. I'm going to stop sharing so everybody can see each other. What is important is more our ethical commandments, and we don't worry about the details of the ritual commandments. Those are between us and God, and we're going to see this develop over the next 150 years, actually 130, 140 years. Jay.
I forgot what I was going to say, but you
Okay.
said something that I want to add it. If you really think that working with Mormon people because they are so honest, Rabbi, you have.
That's my experience.
Oh, I can tell you about my experience, but I won't tell you on TV.
No, that's L'Shem Hara. Let's not talk about that.
I was just simply going to say that I was involved in Mormon culture for several years in my 20s, and I saw a broad mix of behaviors, but the idea was that you didn't do it where people could see.
Exactly.
Okay, so yeah, foibles and so on. I'm just telling you what my experience is, and I think it's more important to be ethical than to be ritually precise. Clearly, that makes me a Reformed Jew, and not an Orthodox Jew. An Orthodox Jew would say, God gives us all these commandments. It is not up to us to decide which one God really means. Alan.
So I'm enjoying this for a couple of reasons. One is as you know, Rabbi, and most of you know, I've read these platforms many times, but not as slowly and as carefully. So I'm enjoying that part. And I'm also enjoying, as always, I enjoy the way Bryce actually his oratorial style. So I'm enjoying both those parts. I just want to share that before we end.
This is a great example of what the Mishnah calls a machloket l'shem shamayim. A machloket is an argument. It is. I don't know if you would call it a kerfuffle, but the issue is whether it is aimed at improving our understanding in our world, or whether it's aimed at humiliating or putting down another person.
Exactly.
And if you watch television, you will see examples of both.
Not
Lois.
much of the first, though.
Lois.
Did you call on me?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. What this made me think about almost from the first or second sentence is the importance of humility. Because when I grew up in the Reform movement in the 50s and the 60s, it was just beginning to change from this sort of anti-Zionism or not very much focus on Zion to being very Zionist, probably the strongest of the movements. And looking at what they were saying in the 1860s, it made me think how humble we should be about what we think is right and correct.
Yes, yeah, that's actually a very good point. Yeah, things change, and I think, you know, Bryce was talking about that sort of the arc of opinion. Okay, well, I hope you're enjoying it, and as I
Very
said,
good.
I
Loving
like
it.
Alan, have read these many times, but there's a difference between reading a text and really studying a text, and so that's the advantage of doing.
It's
Can
one
I
of
tell
my
you,
favorite parts of Torah study.
can I tell you Isaac Meyer Wise story if we're not out of time?
Sure.
Okay, so I grew up in Albany, New York, and not when I was growing up, but I later learned that Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise was actually the rabbi at, the names had changed a little bit, but the synagogue really was where he was. He was in Albany, New York.
Mhm.
He left Albany because he got into a fist fight with the president of the synagogue on Yom Kippur.
Mhm.
That's you're nodding because that's actually in the annals of the Jewish archives. And what he did when he still was passionate about creating a American Judaism, but he wasn't quite along his his development of his approach. So he says to himself, I just need to find a job. And where are the Jews? Well, the Jews are going west. So I'm going to create a Jewish community as far west as Jews will ever go. And that's how he picked Cincinnati.
Yeah. No, he definitely got into a fist fight. One of my classmates got into a fist fight, not with the president of a congregation, but with a member of the congregation. And
Was it on an empty stomach on Yom Kippur, like in the story?
No, it was no. I don't think there was anything elevated about that particular fist fight, and the guy actually lost his pulpit as a result.
If you haven't, let me put a plug in for the American Jewish Archives, and you can look that up. The American Jewish Archives is essentially a library of all kinds of Jewish history, not just Reform. It's based in Cincinnati, but it has a lot of online resources, and so that's where you can get you can get more details about the Treifa banquet and other things if you go to that website. And there's other great things, and that I encourage you to be aware of it at least. Thank you.
I remember once getting on a Delta Airlines flight, and they would be projecting. They actually had little TV screens above the of where you were walking, and they projected cute statements. And my favorite one was, it says, "Curiosity is the cure for boredom." And then you wait a few beats, and then they said, "There is no cure for curiosity." So if you're curious about anything, particularly now with the internet, you can find it. Okay, well, tune in next week for the Columbus platform in 1937. We're going to move ahead, I don't know, 40, almost 50 years.
This is great. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. So see you next time. Take care.
Bye.
Rabbi, I have a quick question for you.
Okay.
I tried to look at the YouTubes from Monday night